In the courtroom, Damon Kemp thought he could get away with murder. He thought no one would notice. As he was wheeled into court, he didn't speak, he screamed, "God! God!
God! God! God! God! God! God! God! God!
I've reviewed your arrest warrant to determine whether there's probable cause for your...
His voice echoed through the room, his eyes darting wildly, his behavior completely out of control. But the real question wasn't why he was screaming. It was, what was he hiding? 2 young men lay dead, but the truth of what happened that night was still a mystery. Kemp, his demeanor cold and unbothered, seemed sure that the law couldn't touch him. His arrogance was unnerving, as if he believed he could escape justice with nothing but defiance in his eyes. But what he didn't realize was that the truth would find its way to the surface, and when it did, it would expose everything. Curious to know how this shocking case unfolds? Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us as the truth finally comes to light. On the morning of the 7th of December 2018, officers returned to Jade Park Apartments in Daytona Beach on what should have been a routine follow-up, unrelated to violence. But nothing about what they were about to find could have prepared them for the scene inside apartment 434. When police stepped through the doorway, the silence hit first. No movement, no voices, just stillness. Inside the apartment were the bodies of 2 19-year-olds, Trey Ingram and Jordan Payton. Both young men had their entire futures ahead of them. Trey, once a student at Bethune-Cookman University, had been trying to get his life back on track. Friends later described him as determined, hard-working, and always willing to help others. Jordan was visiting that night, and he never made it home. There were no frantic 911 calls from neighbors. No alarms. No cries for help reported. But later, witnesses revealed something chilling. People in the building heard gunshots that night, and no one called for help. By the time officers entered the apartment, nearly 14 hours had passed. For investigators, this wasn't just a crime scene, it was a troubling mystery. Who pulled the trigger? Why were 2 young men dead inside a unit that should have been a place of safety? And how had so much time gone by before anyone checked? The questions grew even heavier once detectives learned that Damon Kemp, a young man who had occasionally stayed in that very apartment, had already been taken into custody hours earlier for a separate armed burglary in the same complex. The timing raised eyebrows immediately. Why was he arrested the same night? What was his connection to Trey and Jordan? And was the burglary connected to the murders, or just a coincidence? Neighbors later told police that Kemp had been acting oddly around that time. One report described him as talking rapidly, jumping between strange topics, and appearing disconnected from reality. But was that behavior a sign of guilt? Or something else entirely? As detectives worked through the apartment, the questions kept piling up. There were no eyewitnesses stepping forward. There were no clear leads at first glance. All they had were 2 young men gone before their time and a suspect already behind bars on a completely different charge. From this moment on, the investigation would become a race against uncertainty. The community wanted answers, the families demanded justice, and the police were under pressure to figure out how 2 promising young lives had been cut short inside a quiet apartment on Jimmy Ann Drive. But this was only the beginning. Because as the investigation deepened, the attention would shift from the apartment to the one man police believed could explain what happened that night. Was this the turning point? Or would the truth remain buried a little longer? If you were in this neighborhood that night, would you have called the police? Or thought it was nothing? Let me know in the comments. As the truth started to come together, the focus moved to Damon Kemp and the way he carried himself once he stepped into the courtroom. And that's when the world saw a side of him no one expected. When Damon Kemp was brought into the courtroom, the tension was immediate. This wasn't just any courtroom appearance. This was a man charged with 2 counts of murder, yet, as the courtroom waited in silence, Kemp's demeanor seemed almost disconnected from the gravity of the situation. He didn't sit quietly. He didn't wait his turn. Instead, he was wheeled into the courtroom, and almost immediately, his erratic behavior began. "God! God!" he screamed repeatedly. His voice echoed, unnerving everyone present. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something, or perhaps trying to make sense of his own thoughts. This wasn't the reaction you'd expect from someone facing the serious charges he was. The judge, visibly shaken by his outburst, immediately ordered silence, but the damage was done. Kemp's behavior raised the stakes. Was this the reaction of a man in distress, or someone who believed the law could never touch him? As the courtroom settled, Kemp's emotional state seemed to shift, but his arrogance was undeniable. He didn't show fear or remorse. Instead, he displayed an almost mocking confidence, as if he was convinced nothing could stop him. Even as victims' families looked on in horror, there was a chilling feeling in the room. Was this just an act, or was it something more? Despite his bizarre outbursts, Kemp showed little regard for the seriousness of the situation. His body language, his expressions, everything seemed to signal that he believed the case wouldn't touch him. It was as though he had already convinced himself that he would walk free. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. What kind of person behaves this way? What did it mean? Could he really believe he was untouchable? The key moment came when the judge denied him bond. The decision was straightforward, given his behavior, but it was the first real sign that Kemp's world was already beginning to unravel. His arrogance had backfired. His defiant behavior was not helping his case. It was pushing him further into a corner. But the shocking part of this story wasn't just his outbursts. It wasn't even his lack of remorse. The truth was, Kemp thought he was untouchable, and the law was still miles away from him. Yet, something much more dangerous was about to surface. What if Kemp's defiance wasn't just arrogance? What if it was a sign of something far more dangerous? Was he really acting alone, or was someone about to turn on him? With his defense team working behind the scenes to prepare their case, it was clear that Kemp had one choice to make. Would he continue down the path of defiance, or would he finally confront the truth? The truth about the night of the murders was still hidden in the shadows, but a key testimony was about to bring it to light. Could it be the turning point in the case? But as Kemp's defense continued to crumble, something far more powerful was emerging: the undeniable evidence. The ballistics and forensics would soon show the truth in a way no defense could dismiss. And that's when the case took a sharp turn toward a shocking revelation. As the case moved forward, the truth wasn't going to be found solely in testimony or words. It would come from something far more definitive: the evidence. The investigation, which had initially seemed stalled by a lack of witnesses and no clear leads, was now beginning to take shape. Detectives were connecting the dots, and the physical evidence they uncovered would soon change everything. The breakthrough came when ballistics tests confirmed something critical: the gun used in the murders of Trey Ingraham and Jordan Payton matched one found at Damon Kemp's apartment. Forensic analysis made it clear: this wasn't just a coincidence. The weapon, a firearm tied directly to the crime scene, linked Kemp to the murders in a way that no amount of defense could easily explain away. The tests were irrefutable. There was no escaping the connection. Kemp's gun had been used to kill 2 young men, and now the physical evidence was clear. But the question remained: how did this gun end up in Kemp's possession? The answer would come from further investigation, revealing his involvement in both the murders and a prior armed burglary where the same weapon had been present. The very gun that was now in the hands of law enforcement had been found in his possession when he was arrested for the separate crime, and the evidence trail had led back to him. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one crucial question remained: would this evidence be enough to completely dismantle Kemp's defense? His team was still clinging to the idea that he was not guilty, that he had not committed the crimes, or at the very least, that he was not in control of his actions that night. But with the ballistics reports and the undeniable connection between the gun and the victims, the case was starting to look more and more like a slam dunk for the prosecution. The weight of the evidence was becoming undeniable. It wasn't just testimony or speculation anymore. It was the hard, physical proof linking Kemp to the crime. The ballistics, the forensic analysis, all of it pointed back to him. As the defense scrambled, the truth was getting harder to ignore, and Kemp's once confident position began to crumble. But as the evidence piled up, one question lingered. Would Kemp's arrogance be enough to stand against the overwhelming truth? As the evidence continued to pile up, the tension in the courtroom grew. Kemp's defense was crumbling, but one thing still remained: the truth. How long could he continue to deny his involvement in the murders? The pivotal moment was approaching the big reveal. Would this be the turning point that shattered his defense completely? Or would the defendant, still clinging to his belief that he was untouchable, remain unscathed? As the ballistics expert took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. With each word, the reality became clearer. This wasn't just circumstantial, this was proof. The gun wasn't a random object. It was tied to Kemp, and now there was no hiding from the truth. But it wasn't just the gun. As the prosecution dug deeper into Kemp's actions that night, the pattern began to emerge. Kemp had been in control, not a helpless bystander. His erratic behavior wasn't a sign of innocence, it was the behavior of someone who thought he could escape responsibility. Kemp's smirk, once a symbol of his defiance, had now become a telltale sign of his denial, and it was no longer enough to shield him from the truth. The room grew tense as the last of the key witnesses spoke. The prosecution's case now felt undeniable. The question wasn't just whether Kemp would be convicted. It was whether his defiance could survive the overwhelming evidence. Was he really so sure of himself? Or had his arrogance finally led him to believe that the truth couldn't touch him? With the evidence now pointing directly to Kemp, the question remained: would he continue to deny his involvement, or would the weight of the truth finally force him to confront the consequences of his actions? As the trial neared its conclusion, the final twist was looming. Would the jury return a verdict of justice, or would Kemp's last-ditch defiance drag the courtroom into an unexpected turn? In the next moments, everything would change, and the courtroom would face its most intense confrontation yet. As the trial progressed into its final moments, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony had been damning, and yet Damon Kemp remained defiant. His confidence hadn't wavered, or so it seemed. But something was changing. The more the case unfolded, the clearer it became that Kemp had never truly understood the severity of his actions. His arrogance, once a shield, was now a liability, leaving him exposed in a way no defense could protect. Kemp's lawyer, despite their best efforts, couldn't hide the truth any longer. The ballistics, the forensic evidence, and the testimony from witnesses had created an airtight case. Yet Kemp continued to deny and deflect, refusing to face the consequences of what he'd done. The turning point came when the jury began their deliberation. Inside that room, the weight of the evidence was too heavy to ignore. But what struck many was Kemp's failure to take responsibility. Would his arrogance be the final nail in the coffin, or would his defiance give him the false hope of escaping the truth once again? The twist wasn't just in the verdict. It was in how the case had played out. Despite Kemp's insistence on his innocence, the facts painted a clear picture of a man who had intentionally taken 2 young lives. The jury had heard the evidence, they had seen the emotional toll it took on the victims' families, and they had heard Kemp's silence in the face of overwhelming guilt. The last moments in court were chilling. Kemp was faced with the realization that no amount of mockery or defiance could change the truth. The gravity of the situation finally started to sink in, but by then, it was too late. His fate had been sealed. As the judge prepared to read the verdict, the room held its breath. Kemp's final moments of defiance were on full display, but the question remained: how much longer could he hold on to his lies, knowing that the truth was already out? Kemp's defiance was finally being shattered, piece by piece. The verdict was coming, and with it, the consequences of everything he had done. Would justice finally be served? As the jury returned to the courtroom, the room was electric with anticipation. The final moment had arrived. Would the truth deliver the justice the families had been waiting for? Or would Kemp's last-ditch efforts to deflect his fate fall on deaf ears? All eyes were on the judge, who was about to make the final call. The story was far from over, and what came next would determine if the consequences of his actions were truly final. The moment had arrived. The trial that had gripped the courtroom for so many weeks, the case that had torn at the hearts of so many, was finally nearing its conclusion. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, the room grew silent with anticipation. The decision was in their hands, but the true weight of the moment was about to be felt. The judge's voice echoed in the courtroom, clear and unyielding. Damon Kemp, you have been found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of armed burglary. The words hung in the air, settling heavily on everyone in the room. Justice, in a sense, had been served, but the pain left in the wake of the tragedy couldn't be erased by a verdict. As the judge continued to read the sentence, it became clear that Kemp's arrogance had led him to this moment. 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each of the murders and 1 for the armed burglary. There was no chance for parole. There would be no second chances for Kemp. His fate had been sealed. But the real emotional impact was felt not in the finality of the sentence itself, but in the victims' families. Trey Ingraham's mother, Jordan Payton's father, their faces told the story that no words could fully express. For them, this wasn't just a verdict, it was the end of a long, painful journey. They had spent years waiting for justice, for something to ease the ache of their loss. But even with Kemp's conviction, that ache remained. It would never fully disappear. The camera caught their eyes, filled with a mix of grief and relief. Relief, knowing that the man who had taken their loved ones from them would never be free again. Grief, because no verdict could bring back their sons, no sentence could undo what had been done. As Kemp stood there, silent and unmoving, he finally faced the consequences of his actions. His defiance, his mocking arrogance, it was all gone. The courtroom had seen through it. The families had seen through it. And now, he would pay for what he had done. For Kemp, the moment had to be one of reckoning. Standing there, hearing the sentence handed down, the weight of his choices came crashing down. His chance for redemption had long passed, and now he would spend the rest of his life in prison, forced to reckon with the decisions that had led to the deaths of 2 young men. But for the victims' families, the finality of the sentence didn't erase the pain. Trey's dreams of a bright future, Jordan's hope for a better life, those had been taken. In the courtroom, as the verdict was handed down, the families mourned for the lives cut short, for the potential lost, and for the years they would never get back. The judge spoke again, reinforcing the seriousness of the crimes committed. This was cold-blooded murder, and the impact on these families is immeasurable. The room was silent, save for the soft sobs of those who had been touched by this tragedy. Trey and Jordan would never have the chance to grow old, to live the lives they had dreamed of, and for their families, this sentence, while necessary, would never fill the empty space left by their deaths. As the gavel came down, marking the finality of Kemp's fate, the question remained, could the families ever truly heal from the pain left behind? The sentence was delivered, but the impact would last a lifetime. The trial was over, the sentence delivered, but the emotional toll of what had transpired would linger for years to come. As the families of the victims begin to heal, the final question stands: was justice truly served, or does it come at too high a cost for those left behind? As we reach the conclusion of this case, it's time to reflect on the emotional journey we've just witnessed. Damon Kemp's case was a dramatic reminder of the choices we make and the consequences that follow. Kemp's behavior in the courtroom was striking. His lack of remorse, his defiance, was that just arrogance, or was it something deeper? If you were in the courtroom that day, how would you have felt seeing someone act so indifferent to the pain they caused? Do you think Kemp showed any remorse throughout the trial, or was he simply trying to protect himself at all costs? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you would have reacted. Did you feel justice was served, or was the sentence too harsh? If this case left you thinking, make sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss out on the next one. Stay engaged, your thoughts matter, and we want to hear them.